Welcome to another long, slow journey through the forgotten and frankly boring corners of World War II. Tonight's episode is called Berlin Before the Fall, Daily Life in a Collapsing City. We'll quietly drift through the details that history books often skip, because they were, quite honestly, not very exciting then, and they're not very exciting now. But that's the point. You don't need explosions, heroes, or dramatic battles. You just need slow voices, endless details, and a chance to let your mind wander until sleep takes over. So, get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let's begin our quiet march back into the most boring parts of history. Imagine drifting into sleep as we step quietly into Berlin, not the triumphant capital once envisioned, but a weary city teetering on collapse. Its 1945 citizens walk through the streets with ration bags, looking up into the sky for bombers and waiting for an end that seems both certain and never-ending. There are no great battles or notable generals in this story. It's the story of socks drying on windowsills, of bicycles replacing cars, and of quiet whispers shared in cellars during air raids. The overlooked rhythms of daily life in a collapsing city. The Berlin of 1945 was unlike the Berlin of glossy propaganda posters. Here, the monument stood blackened, scarred by air raids. Once proud boulevards were cluttered with rubble, and once confident citizens now lined up for bread with ration cards in hand. There is a slowness in this decline, a strange mixture of routine and ruin. For many, the days blended together. Wake up, sweep away debris from the night's bombing, barter for potatoes, wait for news, and go to bed to the distant thunder of artillery. What does it feel like to live in a city where the walls themselves seem to tremble, where a knock on the door may be as scary as the sirens in the sky? This chapter doesn't set the stage with action. It sets the mood. Imagine the foggy morning air, thick with coal smoke, mingling with the dust from rocks that have fallen. Imagine the smiles of kids still playing in courtyards, their games reverberating in streets that used to have marching bands. Life went on, albeit in soft tones. It was both normal and exceptional. And as the city wakes each morning, Berliners carry on with a quiet resilience. There is fear, yes, but also routine. A city doesn't fall apart all at once. It falls apart slowly over time as people change their everyday habits. In the following episode, we'll go to the bread lines and ration rooms, where the fight for something as simple as a loaf of bread became the most important part of staying alive. So, for a moment, close your eyes and picture the quiet shuffle of Berliners on icy cobblestones, their exhausted hands holding ration cards. The city is breathing hard, but it is still breathing. As this slow unraveling goes on, we start to see what it's like to live in a world that is both strong and weak. Picture it being a really cold morning in Berlin. The streets are gray because of the dust from bombed buildings and the people who are waiting in line. There is no hurry, no talking, just the sound of boots moving slowly across cobblestones. In their hands, folded and guarded carefully, are small slips of paper, ration cards. In 1945 Berlin, food was not bought with money. It was bought with patience, with waiting, and with those fragile pieces of paper that decided who would eat and who would not. Every Berliner knew the rhythm of the bread line. It started early, before the sun was completely up. Mothers in heavy coats tugged their kids along, wanting to be at the front. The queues would go down whole blocks and around corners. People remained still, their breath fogging up the morning air. They held ration cards as if they were the last money in the world. Waiting became a daily task in and of itself. Some people stood with their heads down to save energy. Others mumbled modest things about stories of extra deliveries or about neighbors who had gone missing. There was a heaviness to the air, but also a strange calmness. In the bread line, time slowed, and survival meant patience. Money still existed in Berlin, but it had lost its meaning. Ration cards were more powerful than any coin. Each small slip had promises: a loaf of bread, a few ounces of butter, and maybe some potatoes. People took great care of them, keeping them wrapped up in old wallets or neatly fastened inside coat pockets. Losing a ration card was worse than losing a few bucks. Officials stamped and signed the cards, which gave them the power of law. They were a reminder that the government not only used propaganda to control what people thought, but also what they ate, bite by bite. In this way, the ration card was both a tool to stay alive and a way to control someone. And what of the food itself? Bread was rarely bread as one might know it today. Flour was mixed with fillers, ground barley, potato starch, even sawdust in some cases. Coffee was not coffee, but a bitter substitute made from roasted acorns or chicory root. Butter was replaced with thin spreads of margarine, while meat, when it appeared at all, was stretched thin with breadcrumbs or soy. These substitutes, called ersatz, became the norm. A Berliner could tell the difference, of course, but complaining was useless. The choices were simple: eat what was available or eat nothing. And so, families adjusted, teaching themselves to savor the little they had, stretching every crumb across the day. In a city where ration cards dictated survival, a parallel economy grew in the shadows: bartering. Neighbors traded what they had for what they needed. A bicycle could be exchanged for a sack of coal, a wedding ring for a dozen eggs. When people found cigarettes, they were worth more than gold, and were often swapped for food or medicine. This barter system was quiet and kept secret from the police. But it was very important. It showed how flexible regular people can be. In the end, they constructed networks of survival, not through official channels, but through whispered agreements forged in stairwells, courtyards, and behind blackout curtains. People alter when they don't have enough. It makes people more aware, but it also takes away their hope. People in Berlin learn to live with hunger as a regular friend. Meals become smaller and slower, and they were spread out to make people think they were full. You may boil a single potato and cut it into pieces, then serve it with weak soup. Kids were taught not to ask for more, but to be thankful for what they had. But hunger did more than just make the stomach hurt. It changed how people thought. People started to keep things to themselves, including meals from close friends. Some people hoarded things because they were afraid that the queue tomorrow will deliver nothing. Some people offered their last bits to a youngster or an adult, feeling pride in being kind even when they didn't have anything to give. Scarcity didn't merely influence what people ate. It transformed people themselves. Waiting in line was not only about food, it was about rumors. Every queue was filled with hushed voices, talk of a delivery of sugar, whispers that extra meat might arrive, or gossip about when the war would end. Sometimes the rumors gave hope. Sometimes they only added to despair. There were moments when the bread ran out before the line did. Those at the back were sent away empty-handed, ration cards still clutched tightly, their hope unfulfilled. These were the hardest days, when hunger became anger, but anger had no place to go. Berliners were left with only silence and the knowledge that tomorrow the line would begin again. And so, the bread line was not just a place to collect food. It was a place where Berlin's collapse was felt most clearly, measured in hours of waiting, in slips of paper, in loaves that were smaller and smaller each week. The ration card was both a promise and a reminder of who was in charge. Picture the sound of feet shuffling on cobblestones, the discreet exchange of ration cards, and the fragrance of ersatz bread coming from a bakery. Life went on, not in big speeches or military victories, but in the quiet strength of people who were hungry and waiting for another day. In the next chapter, when the sun sets, we will go down into the basements and bunkers of the city. Blackout curtains and air raid sirens set the tone for every night in Berlin. Another ceremony started when the sun set in Berlin. The curtains were pulled tight, the candles were put out, and the city went dark. Each night, blackout rules changed Berlin, turning the capital of millions into a quiet shadow. It wasn't just fear of bombers. It was also about getting used to living in the dark, when every flicker of light could signify trouble, and every night was a lengthy wait for the sound of sirens. At dusk, guards walked the streets and looked in windows for the tiniest light. Even one candle escaping through a breach could get you in trouble, since that little light could help bombers find their way from above. Families put heavy black cloth over every window. The street lights stayed off. The big boulevards that used to be full of light became so dark that even familiar places seemed strange. This ritual was practiced without question. It became second nature. Before bed, before prayer, before anything else, came the blackout. The city disappeared each night, swallowed by its own silence. The serenity of night was delicate and often broken by the sound of air raid sirens, long, high, and low sounds that woke Berliners up from their sleep. Mothers shook their kids awake, fathers carried lamps, and neighbors ran down the stairs. The sound didn't come out of nowhere. It echoed through deserted streets and gave people just enough time to get to safety. The siren became part of daily life. Children imitated its sound in play, mimicking the rising and falling notes, even as their parents frowned. For some, the siren was terror. For others, it was simply routine, the sound that meant another long night in the basement. People used air raid shelters and basements as second houses. Families packed into tight, wet areas under the ground. The walls had a scent of coal and mold. There were wooden seats along the walls, and people who lived nearby sat on them and didn't talk much. Some others brought blankets and pillows, while others brought bread in the hopes that the night would be short. In the flicker of weak lanterns, people whispered. They whispered prayers, whispered rumors of how close the Soviets had come, whispered about whether tonight would be the night their street was reduced to rubble. Children huddled close, drifting into uneasy sleep on their mother's lap, their dreams interrupted by distant thunder overhead. Every sound mattered underground. The creak of pipes, the rattle of glass, the heavy thud of bombs falling blocks away. Time lost its meaning in the shelters. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into nights, and the silence between explosions was almost more terrifying than the blasts themselves. Despite the fear, the shelters created a strange kind of community. Neighbors who barely spoke during the day now sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing warmth and conversation. Some brought radios, though most broadcasts offered little comfort, just promises of victory that felt more and more hollow. Others passed around a piece of bread, broken into smaller portions. Conversations ranged from the mundane to the desperate. The price of potatoes, the condition of relatives in the countryside, the endless question of how long the war could possibly continue. The shelters echoed with coughs, with sighs, with the shifting of feet. There was no laughter, but there was a quiet endurance. People surviving not alone, but together. When the all-clear finally sounded, Berliners emerged slowly, blinking into the night. Some climbed from cellars to find only dust in the air, relief on their faces. Others stepped into streets where buildings no longer stood. Imagine the quiet after the bombers had passed. The crunch of broken glass underfoot, the smell of smoke, the eerie emptiness of a city that was alive yet wounded. Children looked up at the sky, asking if the planes would come back. Parents did not answer. Instead, they swept rubble from their doorsteps, a ritual as common as drawing blackout curtains. Life went on, even in ruins. The blackout was not a one-time event. It was a cycle, repeated night after night, year after year. For Berliners, sleep came in fragments, an hour here, 2 hours there, always interrupted by sirens or explosions. The human body adapted, but the mind carried the exhaustion. Life without power was more than just a bother. It taught me how to be quiet, how to be patient, and how to let my spirit slowly wear down. Every night the city lost something, not just stone and mortar, but also the hearts of its people. But they kept going. Berlin kept breathing, even when it was dark. People put up with the evenings because they knew morning would come. And so, Berlin lived its nights underground, in cellars and bunkers, in the silence of darkness broken only by sirens and bombs. The blackout became not only a rule, but a way of life, an unending rhythm of concealment, fear, and endurance. Imagine the heavy cloth over the windows, the sound of footfall on stone stairs, and the quiet whispering in crowded basements. Think about the silence that came after, a silence so thick that it could put a tired city to sleep. In the following chapter, we will leave the bunkers and listen to the voices that filled the daylight, the newspapers, the propaganda posters, and the murmurs of radios that were not allowed. Words have their own kind of power, even in the dark. The people of Berlin sought comfort in something other than food, shelter, or even sleep as the nights went on, and bombs flew from the sky. It originated from language. The walls were covered in propaganda posters with big phrases promising victory, even as things fell apart. The media, which used to be a reliable source of information, now controlled people's lives by telling stories of hope in the middle of sadness. But the official story wasn't the only one that people believed. People spoke a different kind of truth behind closed doors, in basements and living rooms. It was like forbidden knowledge that was handed from person to person. These were the words of resistance, the soft whispers of a city struggling to keep its humanity. Every street corner, every spare wall in Berlin was covered with the same familiar slogans. Victory is certain. The Führer will lead us to triumph. These were not just words. They were the foundation of Berlin's fractured morale. The posters had a hypnotic quality, their bright, bold colors shouting their promises. There were soldiers in heroic poses, factories working overtime, and the image of a united, unstoppable Germany. Berliners passed these posters daily. Some glanced at them with a mixture of disbelief and resignation, while others, often the younger generation, read them with hope. The state utilized these posters not only to talk to people, but also to keep things in order in a world that was getting more and more out of control. But even though these messages were everywhere, the city projected a different story. Infrastructure was slowly falling apart. There were fewer soldiers on the streets, and workers looked demoralized. The posters gave people comfort, but it was simply thin comfort, empty promises that made people want more. The daily newspapers had a similar effect. They were filled with headlines about victory, about breakthroughs at the front, about the strength of the German spirit. But anyone who had lived through the past years knew better. Every day, the propaganda articles became more and more disconnected from the reality of daily life. The front page proclaimed the advancement of German forces, yet only the elderly and children seemed to be left on the streets, while the rest of the city struggled to simply survive. The rich had long since left, leaving behind their homes and cars, while the rest of the population was being fed crumbs, if they were lucky. The newspapers, which used to be a good source of news, had turned into tools of lies. They told people what they wanted to hear, not what they needed to know. And as the war went on, it was harder for anyone to accept the editorial board's happy stories. But even though the state controlled information, there were still flaws in the facade. One of the most frightening things that people in Berlin knew was that there were radios that were against the law. These radios, which were typically hidden in basements or behind closed doors, carried news that the government didn't want people to hear. They were a way for people to see the outside world, the BBC, and the reality about what was really going on that was not affected by Nazi propaganda. People clustered around their radios in secret rooms and locations where the walls were thick with terror. They listened closely as the BBC reported on what was really happening on the Western Front and the Soviet drive from the East. These transmissions were a lifeline, a connection to the real world, but they were also hazardous. Having a foreign radio could get you arrested or worse, but people still listened. They listened because the truth was worth the risk, and it became bigger. One person would tell another, and soon a small group of Berliners realized what was actually going on, when the end was approaching and how far the city had fallen from the promises that the propaganda had promised. Not all acts of opposition behind closed doors were violent. It was sometimes muttered words, small acts of disobedience, including painting anti-government slogans on walls, sharing hidden radios, or warning people about the Soviet Union's march into Berlin. These modest, covert acts of disobedience kept the spirit of resistance alive. Many people in Berlin led two lives, one in which they smiled at the authorities and acted like they believed the news, and the other in which they discreetly fought back. During these secret times, they held on to each other's humanity and helped each other when the official tales sought to take it away. People who were brave enough to do so nevertheless told the truth in these small, dark corners, even though the streets were quiet. But living in two worlds was hard on him. It was tiring to live a lie every day and pretend to believe in winning. People who saw through the lies felt the psychological weight of the war. For every Berliner who thought Germany would win, there was another who knew otherwise. And it wasn't only the shortage of food or the continual bombing. It was the impression that the people in charge had let the whole city down. The lies had been going on for too long. The radios, newspapers, and posters all promised victory, but they couldn't hide what was really going on. Berlin was losing the war. Every day, Berlin was losing a little bit more. But the media machine kept spinning its web, trying to convince people that victory was just around the corner. Every day, Berliners woke up to a city that had been destroyed by war, yet the promises of hope they heard were empty. There were propaganda posters on every corner, headlines about victory, and covert broadcasts from the outside world. All of these things told a story that was never fully real. But even with all the lies, the whispered phrase stayed strong. People spread the truth in secret via hidden radios and underground places. This was the silent resistance, refusing to accept the truth in a city that needed it badly, but not using guns or big protests. So, take a moment to think about how important those comments are, both the actual ones and the ones that were meant to trick you. In the next chapter, we'll discuss the children in Berlin who managed to continue playing and fantasizing despite the world around them collapsing. Think about Berlin in 1945, a metropolis that was falling apart. But even here, when things are falling apart, kids still play. Their laughing, which is soft and short, echoes along streets full of debris, where buildings used to stand tall and proud. But these kids are different from the ones who grew up before the conflict. They had grown up with bombs going off around them, airstrikes interrupting their classes, and the harsh truth of rationed food and limited resources. Their youth has been stolen, and the innocence of childhood has been replaced by drills, by uniforms, and by a future uncertain. In the streets of Berlin, the children had a different fate than their parents. The Hitler Youth was no longer just an organization. It was a way of life. Kids as young as 10 had to join. They didn't spend their days in classes. They spent them doing drills, marching, and training to protect the fatherland. The clothes for the Hitler Youth were a bizarre mix of military and children. The boys wore short pants and the girls wore skirts, but they all wore the identical dismal uniforms. It wasn't about having fun. It was about doing your duty. These kids were taught that their whole lives would be dedicated to the cause, and that their worth was based on how obedient and eager they were to give up their own lives. But even with all this brainwashing, there were times when people fought back. A slight smile shared in secret, a joke about the war whispered, anything to remind them that they were still kids, no matter how many drills and marches they did. But good times didn't last long, and soon the lessons of battle would start to hurt. Schools were no longer places to learn. They were places to stay alive. At first, there were a lot of kids in the classrooms, and they were reading poetry, learning history, and practicing their math tables. But as the conflict went on, schools became less about learning and more about remaining safe. During airstrikes, kids gathered together in the basement classrooms while bombs shook the school's very foundations. Teachers tried their best to keep the lessons going, but everyone in the class was clearly anxious. Even though the kids were tough, they were scared. Not of schooling, but of what was outside those boundaries. And then there were the lessons of the war itself. As the bombs fell, the walls of classrooms began to crumble. Children were taught how to handle gas masks, how to identify enemy aircraft, and how to stand at attention when ordered. Instead of reading about the battles of history, they were living through them. In Berlin, education became a privilege rather than a right. Still, there were times when they were kids. In the ruins, kids discovered ways to have fun. Their games were easy, but they were full of life and hope. They played tag and bombed out courtyards, kicked homemade soccer balls through holes in damaged walls, and climbed on the remains of broken buildings like they were castles. But their games were never without worry. There was always a fear of what was to come, even when they were laughing. They always thought about the battle, the sound of artillery fire from far away, the cold of winter, and not knowing what each day would bring. These children were not ignorant of the world around them. They lived in it every day, every hour. And yet, they still played, because to stop playing would be to stop living. They clung to what was left of their innocence, even as it slipped through their fingers. By 1945, the war was no longer just the realm of soldiers. In Berlin, the streets were filled with children wearing makeshift uniforms, holding wooden rifles, and standing in defensive positions. These were not children playing at war. These were children being prepared to fight in it. As the Soviet forces closed in on the city, children were enlisted into the Volkssturm, the last-ditch militia of the German home front. Many were not more than 14 years old, barely taller than the rifles they were handed. They were trained in secret, learning how to fight, how to defend their city. Some of them were even put on the front lines, armed with little more than sheer desperation. These children fought not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. They had been taught from an early age that their duty was to defend the homeland, and by 1945, that duty meant picking up arms, even at the cost of their lives. They were sacrificed, not as soldiers, but as pawns in a war that they did not understand. And when the war ended, they were left with only the scars of a childhood stolen by violence. The true tragedy of these children was not just the war, but what they lost in the process. Childhood is meant to be a time of discovery, of learning and growing. But for the children of Berlin, there was no time for this. There was no time to ask questions, to play without fear, or to dream of a future. Instead, They learned to endure. They learned to survive. And as the war dragged on, they became more like adults than children. They learned to keep their emotions buried, to act tough, to act as if they weren't afraid. But underneath it all, they were terrified. What would happen to them? What would happen to their town? These questions were always there, like a fog over their heads. And when the war was over, a lot of these kids were left with only the quiet trauma of what they had been through. They had seen too much too quickly. They had been through a war that took away their youth and, in many ways, their future. As the war came to an end and Berlin was in ruins, the children who had survived had to put their broken world back together. They had been soldiers, but they had also been hurt. They were no longer innocent, and their futures were unclear. But they also saw something else in their eyes: strength. Now close your eyes and picture the sound of kids laughing as they play in the rubble of Berlin. Their games might appear strange, but they represent the final pieces of a childhood that was taken away by the horrors of war. We will look at Berlin's hidden life in the next chapter, including the markets, cafes, and secret acts of resistance that went on even as the city fell apart around them. Even though Berlin was falling apart all around its people, life went on in quieter, less obvious ways. The city found ways to stay alive, even in the debris and ruins, behind locked doors and in tight passageways. The official story was about winning and giving up. But the real story of Berlin was different. It was a story about markets in the shadows, cafes still selling weak cups of fake coffee, and modest acts of resistance that spoke louder than any propaganda. Berliners turned to the illegal markets when their ration cards ran out and official supplies ran low. These secret places were hidden in bombed-out courtyards, cellars, and alleyways. Here, cigarettes were worth more than money. Butter was so rare that people traded it for jewelry, and a few potatoes could be traded for a coat. People came in the dark, usually at dawn or dusk, and looked around for police patrols. There was a lot of need in the air, but there was also a lot of skepticism. People didn't go to these markets for luxury. They went to stay alive. Mothers looking for milk for their kids, old men trading tools for bread, and soldiers silently trading their own food for tiny luxuries. The black market was risky. Being caught means a heavy sentence, but still, it thrived because hunger does not obey laws. In the collapse of a city, necessity always finds a way. Even in 1945, cafes in Berlin still opened their doors. They served coffee substitutes, dark, bitter brews made from roasted acorns or chicory root. Bread rolls were thin, butter non-existent, and sugar a rare memory. But still, the tables were filled. People came not for the food, but for the comfort of routine. In these cafes, conversations hummed quietly. Workers whispered about shortages. Soldiers spoke of battles no one believed were victories. Families gathered, not for celebration, but to hold on to a sense of normalcy. The walls were often cracked, the windows patched with cardboard, but the sound of spoons clinking in cups was strangely reassuring. In a world falling apart, a cafe offered something priceless: the illusion that life could still be ordinary, even if only for an hour. In the black markets and in the cafes, rumors circulated as freely as cigarettes. One day, someone claimed the Allies were weeks away. The next, another swore that secret weapons would turn the tide. The truth rarely mattered. Rumors gave people something to hold on to, some small narrative to explain the chaos. Berliners became experts at listening without speaking. They nodded, they whispered, they passed along fragments of information. In a city drowning in propaganda, rumor was a different kind of currency, dangerous, unreliable, but often more believable than the official headlines. Resistance in Berlin was not always dramatic. It did not always involve sabotage or gunfire. More often, it was quiet, invisible, almost whispered. A leaflet slipped under a door, graffiti scrawled on a wall in the dead of night, a radio tuned illegally to the BBC. Some groups that opposed the war distributed short leaflets that told Berliners the truth about the war and warned them that it was coming to an end. Some people just shook their heads and didn't say anything at work. These were tiny things, but in a city full of terror, they meant a lot. They reminded people that not everyone believed the lies, and that truth, even if it was weak, was still there. There were also times of bravery, such when a neighbor gave soup to a hungry family, a stranger stopped someone from getting arrested, or someone played a song on a violin among the ruins that was against the law. These weren't fights, but they were wins, even if they were minor ones. Berliners discovered ways to stay human, even when everything was falling apart. A lady sewed together pieces of cloth to make her child a coat. A guy developed a little garden in the ruins of a courtyard, coaxing crops from the ground where bombs had fallen. In the nights, neighbors would get together by candlelight to tell stories and choose connection over despair. One approach to fight back was to talk to each other, share worries, laugh, and remember happier times. It fought back against the war's attempts to keep people quiet. These short, peaceful times showed how powerful people are, not as soldiers or citizens, but as humans. Berlin's subterranean life went on through secret marketplaces, whispered rumors, the thin comfort of cafes, and small acts of rebellion. It was real, although it wasn't very strong and was risky. Picture a small cafe with candles, the fragrance of fake coffee, people paying attention to a black market trade, and a violin playing softly in the background of ruins. These were the smells and sounds of a city that refused to lose its humanity, even as everything else around it was crumbling apart. In the last chapter, we will move closer to the quiet that comes before we give up. The sound of weapons in the distance, the streets getting emptier every day, and the fact that Berlin will fall. By the spring of 1945, Berlin was no longer the capital of an empire. People were living in the shadows of life, and the streets were littered with rubble. Every day, the noise of guns grew louder, like a rainstorm drawing nearer. However, there was also an odd quiet during those final days, a calm acknowledgement that death was near. This wasn't the silence of serenity. It was the silence of a city waiting, holding its breath before giving up. The first signs of the city's collapse came not with bombs, but with distant rumbles. Soviet artillery echoed across Berlin, at first like storms on the horizon, then closer, pounding rhythmically into the earth. People in basements counted the seconds between each strike. Windows shook, ceilings crumbled, and there were extended periods of unnerving silence. The sound of the latter days was explosions followed by silence. During those times of silence, people whispered, prayed, or just sat quietly and stared at nothing, waiting for what everyone knew was going to happen. The front line was no longer far away. It was at the city's gates. As Soviet troops advanced, Berlin's once busy avenues grew empty. Once full with parades and processions, the magnificent Unter den Linden Street turned into a haunting hallway of smoke and silence. Shops were closed, tram lines were disrupted, and flames burned down buildings. People who were still out on the streets moved slowly, heads down, and held onto bundles of things. Families looked for cover in cellars, churches, and homemade bunkers. The city's heartbeat slowed, as if the streets themselves knew their end had come. In those days, there were still soldiers, teenagers drafted into defense units, elderly men pressed into service. They walked around with firearms that were too heavy for their shoulders, looking from one shattered building to the next. They didn't have any optimism or confidence. They only had orders. Many of them knew the fight was pointless. They had seen the Soviets advancing, unstoppable, with tanks and artillery that Berlin could not match. But they had to go to the streets, the checkpoints, and the dwindling illusion of resistance. Their footsteps echoed in the empty space, a hollow cadence that signaled the end of a whole world. Families crowded together in basements that smelled like smoke and dust. Mothers held their children close as gunfire echoed in the distance. The old men sat quietly, looking at the broken walls and thinking about whether they would live to see another morning. Food was nearly gone. Water came in small buckets, shared between dozens. People slept sitting up, too afraid to lie down. The fear was no longer of the bombs, but of what would come after. The fear of invasion, of the unknown, of what surrender would mean. And yet, there was also a strange calm. The waiting was worse than the fighting. The silence before surrender was heavy, but it was also final. The people of Berlin knew the end was coming, and in that knowledge, some found a small measure of peace. The propaganda still tried, even in these final days, to proclaim victory. Posters still hung on walls, though they were torn and faded, ignored by the hungry and the hopeless. Newspapers printed headlines that few even bothered to read. The silence of the city was not only physical, it was ideological. People no longer shouted slogans, no longer believed in promises. They had grown tired of words. All that was left was survival. The city that once roared with speeches now whispered with defeat. And then, it ended. Not with a grand battle, but with exhaustion. Soviet forces pushed into the heart of Berlin, their banners raised over the Reichstag. German officials signed the documents of surrender. The guns fell silent. For Berliners, the moment was not marked by celebration. There were no celebrations in the streets, and nothing could take away the years of pain. There was only silence, a heavy, tired breath. The war was over, but the scars it left would last for a long time. Giving up didn't mean tranquility. It was the sound of a city falling apart. Berlin before the fall was a city full of contradictions. Kids played amid the ruins. Cafés served bitter drinks. Adults muttered about resistance, and the streets were quiet. There wasn't one big brawl or explosion that caused the city to fall apart. Instead, it was the gradual decline of daily life. Now close your eyes and picture it. The sound of cannons dying away, the weight of loss in the air, and the gentle footsteps of people walking into an unknown future. The fall of Berlin was not only the end of a war, it was the end of a world. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey into Berlin's final days. If this calm exploration of history helped you relax, drift to sleep, or simply reflect, consider supporting the channel. Subscribe to get more long-form stories on important but often forgotten moments in history. And if you choose to join me again, we'll keep finding the hidden parts of the past, one slow, steady story at a time. Until then, rest well, and good night.